welcome, hello, and so on. If you've ended up here, I'm guessing one of two things. Either you've been a Marvel fan for years, and you fancy a long, lazy wander through some of the stranger corners of the franchise, or you've never seen a Marvel film in your life, and the algorithm has decided that's an oversight worth correcting. Either way, welcome. I'm glad you're here. This is a long one. We're going to spend a fair amount of time walking through the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Not the films themselves so much, although they'll come up plenty. More the story underneath them. The casting decisions that nearly went the other way. The corporate fights that almost broke the whole thing apart before it really started. The cancelled projects, the recasted heroes, the bits of cosmic lore tucked into corners most viewers walked straight past without noticing. The whole iceberg, if you like. The familiar stuff at the top, the weirder and quieter material the further down we go. A small note before we begin, this isn't going to build to anything. There's no big reveal at the end, no twist, no payoff you have to stay awake for. Each section is its own little thing, sitting alongside the others rather than building on top of them. You can drift off at any point, and you won't miss a moment that mattered. If you wake up in the middle of Section 9, wondering what happened in Section 3, the answer is nothing. You're fine, go back to sleep. The whole format is built for that. If you happen to enjoy this sort of thing, calm, meandering, slightly nerdy, and you want more of it, the subscribe button is there. It's free, it helps the channel an enormous amount, and that's the only time I'll mention it. After this, no more nudges, no calls to action, none of that. Promise. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, just to set the table, is now somewhere in the region of 40 films and over a dozen television series, depending on how you count it. It started in 2008 with Iron Man. It's still going. It has become, by most measures, the most commercially successful film project in cinema history, which is a thing absolutely nobody saw coming in 2007 when Marvel Studios was so broke they had to put their characters up as loan collateral with a bank. We'll get to that in a minute. What's actually interesting about it, and the thing I don't think gets talked about enough, is how much of the modern MCU is the result of decisions that very nearly went the other way. The studio almost didn't exist. The man who runs it almost got fired. The actor who became the face of the whole franchise was nearly turned down because the insurance companies wouldn't cover him. Several of the most iconic films were originally going to be directed by completely different people, with completely different casts, telling completely different stories. The whole thing is held together by a series of close calls and reverse decisions and quiet course corrections that, when you stack them up, start to look like a kind of luck nobody could have planned for. We're going to walk through all of that, starting with the surface stuff, the parts most people who've seen a Marvel film already know, and slowly working down into the parts that even fairly serious fans tend to miss. The Marvel one-shots that exist on Blu-ray menus and on Disney+, the Edward Norton situation, the man named Ike Perlmutter who almost reshaped the entire franchise into something unrecognisable, the Spider-Man rights which have been getting renegotiated continuously for decades and somehow still aren't fully settled, the cosmic lore tucked into background statues, the lawsuits, the strikes, the things that happen at studios this size when nobody's really watching. So that's where we're going. No hurry, no urgency, no big finish, just a long, quiet walk through one of the strangest stories in modern film history. Get comfortable, settle in, and we'll start at the top of the iceberg. Here's a thing that genuinely doesn't get said often enough. In 2005, a couple of years before Iron Man came out, Marvel Studios walked into Merrill Lynch and put up the film rights to 10 of their own characters as collateral on a loan. Captain America, Thor, Black Panther, Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, Hawkeye, Nick Fury, Cloak and Dagger, Power Pack, and Shang-Chi. If the films they were planning to make underperformed, those characters could have been seized by a bank. The most successful franchise in modern cinema was, in its first proper year, one bad box office weekend away from losing Captain America to a financial institution. That's how the whole thing started. The reason Marvel was in that position is the same reason most of the studio's pre-MCU history reads like a fire sale. Marvel went bankrupt in the late 90s. To survive, they sold off the film rights to most of their valuable characters. Spider-Man went to Sony in 1999 for a sum that, depending on whose accounting you believe, hovered somewhere in the single-digit millions. The X-Men and Fantastic Four went to Fox. Hulk went to Universal. By the time Marvel was ready to make their own films, the characters they actually owned outright were the leftovers. Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, Hulk but only sort of, and a roster of names most general audiences had never heard of. Honestly, ask anyone in 2007 if they were excited about a Thor film, and you'd have seen some genuinely confused faces. So the studio was working with the characters nobody else wanted, on a loan that had their own intellectual property as the safety net, and they had to make it work. The man tasked with making it work, alongside producer Avi Arad and a small team of executives, was Kevin Feige. Feige was 32 at the time. He'd been around Marvel Productions for years as a junior producer, mostly on the Sony and Fox films. He had a comics encyclopedic memory and a clear vision for how this could all connect. But he was also, in the eyes of the rest of the industry, a kid with a wild idea about a shared cinematic universe that no studio had ever pulled off before. The decision that probably saved the whole thing was hiring Jon Favreau to direct Iron Man, and then letting Favreau cast Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark. Both of those decisions were resisted internally, and the RDJ one in particular was a fight. Downey had spent decades as one of Hollywood's most public addiction stories. He'd been arrested multiple times. He'd been fired from a major TV show. The insurance companies that underwrite films had, at one point, refused to cover him. Marvel's leadership did not want him in the role. Favreau pushed and pushed, and eventually got the studio to agree to let Downey do a screen test. The test was apparently so good that the room shut up. There's a fun fact about that screen test that I think gets glossed over. The footage from it is reportedly excellent. Downey, in his early 40s, sitting in a chair, doing dialogue that would be used in the film Iron Man. The line about wanting a cheeseburger, the casual, self-aware, slightly chaotic Tony Stark we all know now. He was already that character from the audition. The film didn't have to find Tony Stark. Downey just walked in being him. And then there's the line. Honestly, this is one of my favourite bits of Marvel trivia, even though it's been told 100 times. At the end of Iron Man, in the press conference where Tony is supposed to use the cover story, that Iron Man is his bodyguard, Downey improvised the line, "I am Iron Man." That wasn't in the script. The scripted line was something much more conservative and much more conventional, the kind of secret identity dance that superhero films had used for decades. Downey just decided in the moment that Tony Stark wouldn't do that. He'd own it. He'd lean into it. The director kept the take, the studio kept the take, and that single improvised moment basically rewrote how the MCU would approach identity from then on. No masks, no double lives, the hero is the person. That was a Downey decision. The other massive thing that came out of Iron Man's release is the post-credits scene with Nick Fury. Samuel L. Jackson appears in a darkened room, talks about an Avengers initiative, and walks out. The scene was short, it cost almost nothing to film, and it changed the entire grammar of blockbuster cinema. Before Iron Man, post-credits scenes existed mostly as gags or outtakes. Animated films sometimes had them. Comedies sometimes had them. They were sometimes used for comedic relief, but many post-credits scenes were treated as serious story extensions throughout the MCU. After Iron Man, every studio with a franchise tried to do the same thing, and most of them did it badly. The Marvel post-credits scene became a kind of contract with the audience. Sit through the credits. We've got a little something for you. That contract has held for nearly 2 decades now. The Samuel L. Jackson thing is even better. Jackson reportedly signed a 9-picture deal with Marvel. Long contract negotiations defined the MCU's early model. Multi-picture deals were standard until studios began phasing them out. He turned up, did the scene, and committed to being Nick Fury across however many films Marvel needed him for. The story I've heard is that Jackson and Marvel worked out the terms over a fairly short conversation, and that was that. For an actor of Jackson's stature to commit to a franchise this loosely before the franchise even existed in any real form was either a profound act of trust or a profound act of, sure, why not? Possibly both. What I find genuinely strange about all of this, looking back, is how thin the ice was. The studio almost didn't exist. The character collateral could have been seized. The lead actor was nearly turned down. The improvised line that defined the franchise's whole approach was a last-minute call from the actor himself. The post-credits scene that became cinema's most copied storytelling device cost basically nothing and was, internally, treated as a minor flourish. None of this was inevitable. Almost all of it could have gone the other way. And yet here we are, decades on, talking about it. One more detail before we move on. Avi Arad, the producer who'd been with Marvel for years and had championed the studio approach, ended up leaving Marvel Studios in 2006. He'd been instrumental in the early development of the MCU concept, and he disagreed with some of the direction the studio was taking. He stayed involved with Sony's Spider-Man films and various other Marvel projects in a peripheral way, but the company he'd helped build moved on without him. It's a small footnote in the official story, but it's one of those moments where you can see how easily things might have gone differently. Different producer in the chair, different vision, different studio. Fair play to Feige for what he built on top of that early foundation, but Arad was there first. Worth a mention. Anyway, that's the surface tier. Iron Man worked, the post-credits scene set the hook, and Marvel Studios was suddenly the most exciting thing in Hollywood. What happened next is its own slightly stranger story, and it involves Shakespeare, of all things. The reason Thor exists in the form it does is essentially because Kenneth Branagh likes Shakespeare. That's not a joke. Branagh, who spent the bulk of his career directing and starring in adaptations of Henry V and Hamlet and Much Ado About Nothing, was the man Marvel handed Thor to in 2010. The pitch, from what I understand, was that Branagh saw the whole Asgardian family conflict, the father, the two sons, the betrayal, the exile, as essentially a Shakespearean tragedy in spandex. He wasn't wrong about that. Thor, as a story, is much closer to King Lear than it is to anything in conventional superhero cinema, and giving it to a director who actually knew how to stage that kind of family drama is probably the only reason the film didn't collapse into camp. The casting of Chris Hemsworth is its own slightly funny little story. Hemsworth auditioned for the role and was selected. He didn't get to a callback. The studio reportedly didn't see him as Thor, so Hemsworth went home a bit disappointed, and his younger brother Liam took the audition materials and went in himself. Liam apparently did well enough that the studio brought him back for multiple rounds of testing. But Liam, who at the time was less experienced, kept missing the mark on the specific weight and bearing the character needed. At some point during all of this, Chris's people went back to Marvel and asked if Chris could have another go. He did. He nailed it. He got the part his brother had been auditioning for. Liam went on to become Gale in the Hunger Games, which honestly worked out for both of them. But for a brief stretch in 2009, the Thor we all know was nearly the other Hemsworth. Family dinners must have been interesting. Captain America's casting and direction is a bit less dramatic, but contains one of my favourite Marvel hires. Joe Johnston, the director, had made The Rocketeer back in 1991, a film about a pulp-era American hero with a jetpack and a love interest who looks like she stepped out of a 1940s magazine. It is, in tone and look and texture, almost a dry run for Captain America, the first Avenger. The fact that Marvel found the one director who had already made a film with that exact aesthetic and just hired him to do it again is, I think, one of the smarter casting calls the studio has ever made. You can argue about whether the first Avenger is the best of the Captain America trilogy, but the period stuff in it is genuinely beautiful, and Johnston is the reason. There's also the small matter of how the film handles the time problem. Captain America is in the comics frozen in ice at the end of the Second World War and thawed out decades later. The MCU needed a way to get him into the modern day for the Avengers without spending an entire third act on it. Their solution was the cleanest possible version of the device. He goes into the ice. He comes out of the ice. The film ends with him in modern New York being told he's been asleep for nearly 70 years. There's no time travel, no science explanation, no extended sequence of him adjusting. Just the simplest possible mechanism, used as efficiently as possible. The MCU has done a lot of complicated things over the years, and watching them solve this particular structural problem with one decisive cut still impresses me. They didn't overthink it. Now, The Avengers, the film that actually had to make the shared universe concept work. Joss Whedon was hired to write and direct it on the strength of his work on Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Firefly, both of which were ensemble pieces with large casts that had to share screen time without anyone disappearing. Whedon's specific skill, the thing he was genuinely good at before everything went sideways for him later, was making ensembles feel balanced. Every character gets a moment. Every relationship gets a scene. Nobody is just there to fill a slot. That skill is essentially the entire reason The Avengers worked as a film. You had 6 lead characters from 4 separate franchises, and the film had to convince audiences that all of them belonged in the same room. Whedon's instinct for ensemble dynamics is what made that possible. Whedon also threw out the script and started from scratch. The version that existed before he came on was apparently a much more conventional team-up film. Whedon added the personality conflicts, the bickering, the way every character has a specific verbal rhythm and a specific kind of comedy. The Loki and Hulk moment where Hulk just slams Loki around like a rag doll, that's pure Whedon humour. The puny god line. The whole Tony and Steve antagonism that sets up Civil War years later. A lot of what people remember as the texture of the first Avengers film is Whedon's writing voice layered onto an existing framework. Here's a fun fact about the shawarma scene, which is the post-credits gag at the end of The Avengers, where the entire team is sitting in a shawarma restaurant in silence, eating. That scene wasn't in the original cut of the film. Robert Downey Jr. suggested it. He mentioned in a press interview, almost as an aside, that he wanted to try shawarma. Whedon and the producers decided to actually film it as a tag. They brought the entire cast back for a reshoot weeks after the film had wrapped. Some of the cast were genuinely difficult to round up. Chris Evans had grown a beard for another project, and you can see him sort of hiding behind his hand in the shot. The scene is about 30 seconds long and contains no dialogue. It's one of the most beloved post-credits scenes in MCU history, and it exists because Robert Downey Jr. mentioned a food he was curious about. The other thing worth saying about the first Avengers is that it shouldn't have worked. The idea of a shared cinematic universe, multiple films with their own casts, directors and tones, all paying off into one team-up, had been tried before in television, but never in film at this scale. There were industry people in 2011 who thought The Avengers would collapse under the weight of its own ambition. Too many characters, too many storylines to service. Audiences wouldn't follow the connections. The film made roughly $1.5 billion worldwide and proved every single one of those concerns wrong. From that point on, the shared universe model became the default in blockbuster cinema, with varying degrees of success. Most of the imitators, honestly, were just imitators. Marvel had figured out something specific about how to make these things work, and the something specific was, at least partly, Joss Whedon's instinct for ensembles. What I will say, and this is going to come up properly later, is that the experience of writing and directing the second Avengers film, Age of Ultron, more or less broke him. He's been pretty open about that in the years since. The collaboration with Marvel, which left Whedon exhausted from Phase 1, proved challenging as he entered Phase 2. though he continued to appreciate Marvel's creative trust and approach. Without getting into all the reasons here, because we're saving the corporate side for its own section, the short version is that Whedon's instincts and the studio's instincts diverged sharply during Age of Ultron, and he came out of it noticeably worn down. The man who built the Avengers as an ensemble didn't really come back to the franchise after that. He went to rework Justice League for Warner Brothers, which is its own absolute mess, and his career has had a complicated few years since. But the foundation he laid in 2012, the way these characters talk to each other, the way they fight, the way they take the piss out of each other in between cosmic threats, that's still the template the franchise runs on. Anyway, with Phase 1 in the bag and the team up working, Marvel started experimenting with smaller format content. Most of it has been quietly forgotten. We'll talk about that next. There's a small pocket of MCU content that exists almost nowhere now. It was made between 2011 and 2014. It runs to about an hour and a half of footage total. And for years, the only way you could watch it was to own the physical Blu-rays of various Marvel films and dig through the special features menus until you found it. They were called the Marvel One-Shots, and most people I talk to about Marvel have either never heard of them or vaguely remember that one of them existed without being able to name it. So this section is, in a small way, a tribute to the bits of the MCU that almost nobody watches anymore. There were 8 of them in total. The first was called The Consultant, released in 2011 on the Thor Blu-ray. It's about 4 minutes long. It features Agent Coulson and Agent Sitwell, both already established characters by that point, sitting in a diner trying to work out how to keep Emil Blonsky of the Avengers Initiative. The conceit is that the World Security Council wants Emil Blonsky for the team, and SHIELD doesn't, and the agents need to come up with a plan to make him so unbearable that the council changes its mind. The solution is that they send Tony to talk to General Ross about the Incredible Hulk, and the fallout, presumably, is what we see at the end of that film when Tony Stark turns up at a bar to tell Ross about a team being put together. It's a tiny piece of connective tissue, and the only piece of the MCU that has ever actually explained why that strange post-credits scene happened the way it did. I genuinely enjoy this one. It's a minor work and a charming one. The second one, which has the longest title of anything Marvel has ever produced, is called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Thor's Hammer. It was on the Captain America Blu-ray. Again, very short. Coulson stops at a petrol station, walks in to buy donuts, and ends up foiling an armed robbery using his hand-to-hand combat skills. There's no real plot beyond that. It's essentially a 5-minute action gag where you get to see Coulson, usually the quiet bureaucrat of the franchise, actually fighting people. It's a fan service piece, made for the people who liked Coulson and wanted to see him do something. Which, fair enough, is how you should treat a side character that audiences have started to love. The third is Item 47 from 2012 on the Avengers Blu-ray. This one is a little more ambitious. A young couple in New York finds a Chitauri weapon left over from the Battle of New York, and they decide to use it to rob banks. 2 SHIELD agents, one of whom is Maximiliano Hernandez as Sitwell again, and the other played by Titus Welliver, are sent to retrieve the weapon and deal with the couple. It runs about 12 minutes. It has a proper little plot. It introduces the idea that there's alien tech scattered around New York after the invasion, which is something the MCU never quite followed up on directly until Spider-Man: Homecoming 5 years later, when the Vulture turns out to be doing exactly the same thing the couple in Item 47 was doing. Item 47 is, I think, the most underrated of the one-shots. It does proper world building. It quietly establishes a thread that pays off years later, and almost nobody watched it. If you've never seen it, I'd actually recommend it. The fourth from 2013 is the one that probably had the most lasting impact. It's called Agent Carter, and it's a 15-minute short about Peggy Carter in 1946, a year after the events of the first Avenger, working for the precursor to SHIELD and being routinely overlooked by her male colleagues because, well, 1946. The short ends with Howard Stark calling her up and offering her a co-founder position in SHIELD itself. The response to this short was strong enough that Marvel decided to develop it into a full television series, which ran for 2 seasons on ABC starting in 2015. The TV show is, in my opinion, one of the best things Marvel ever made for television. It got cancelled too early, but the whole reason it existed in the first place was a 15-minute special feature on a Blu-ray that most people probably never watched. The 5th and final one-shot is the one we've already mentioned in passing, but it deserves a proper look. It's called All Hail the King, from 2014, released on the Thor: The Dark World Blu-ray. It's a Trevor Slattery short. Ben Kingsley, reprising his role from Iron Man 3, sitting in a prison cell called Seagate Penitentiary, being interviewed by a documentary filmmaker. The filmmaker turns out to be a member of the Ten Rings terrorist organization, sent to retrieve Slattery because the real leader of the Ten Rings, referred to in the short as the real Mandarin, is unhappy that Slattery used his title for a fraudulent media campaign. The short ends with Slattery being broken out of prison and presumably taken to meet the man whose name he'd been wearing. That whole short, by the way, was a course correction. The director of Iron Man 3, Shane Black, basically said in an interview years later that All Hail the King was made as an apology to fans who'd been upset by the Mandarin twist. The Drew Pearce, who wrote and directed it, has said it was less an apology and more an excuse to tease the character's future. I think, honestly, it's both. We'll talk about the Mandarin in more detail later, because that whole situation has its own little corner of the iceberg, but the one-shot itself is, I think, genuinely one of the better small pieces of MCU storytelling, and it did eventually pay off, although it took 7 years for the payoff to arrive in the form of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. By the way, there's a small canonicity wrinkle worth mentioning. All Hail the King establishes some lore about the Mandarin name being ancient. Advisor to the king, it says. Shang-Chi, when it came out, retconned that. In the film, Wenwu explicitly says that the Mandarin name was invented by Aldrich Killian, which directly contradicts what the one-shot tells us. Marvel just sort of moved past it without acknowledgement, which is how a lot of these continuity wrinkles get handled in the MCU, honestly. If you stare at it too hard, the threads don't always line up. Most viewers don't stare at it that hard, and the franchise quietly moves on. The one-shots continued after All Hail the King. There were a few reasons. Marvel Television was expanding into the Netflix shows, and Agents of SHIELD, which started taking the kind of connective tissue work the one-shots had been doing. Disney Plus, when it eventually launched, became the new format for short-form Marvel content. Although that became something different, 6-episode prestige series rather than 15-minute Blu-ray extras. And honestly, by 2014, Marvel was producing enough feature films that the appetite for additional supplementary content had reduced. The one-shots had served their purpose. They'd kept fans engaged between major releases, they'd tested a few ideas, and one of them had even spawned a TV series. Marvel quietly moved away from the one-shot format in favour of special presentations. I find this little tier of the MCU genuinely endearing. There's something nice about a major franchise putting out little 15-minute stories with no real commercial pressure, just as bonus material for the people who own the discs. It's a thing the modern Marvel machine probably wouldn't do anymore. Everything has to feed the next big release now. The one-shots felt like Marvel still had time for small ideas. Anyway, speaking of small things that turned into big things, let's talk about the green one. I've always found it interesting how completely Mark Ruffalo has erased Edward Norton from the cultural memory of the MCU's Hulk. If you ask most people on the street, including reasonably committed Marvel fans, who plays the Hulk, the answer is Ruffalo. Has been for years, will probably stay that way until they recast again. But Norton came first. In 2008, the same year as Iron Man, Marvel released The Incredible Hulk, with Edward Norton playing Bruce Banner. It's a film that exists in this strange grey area of the MCU now, officially canon, largely ignored. quietly absorbed back into the broader timeline whenever Marvel feels like acknowledging it, which is more often than you'd think. The Incredible Hulk is, by all accounts, the awkward middle child of Phase 1. It came out a month after Iron Man in June 2008. It made considerably less money than Iron Man, somewhere in the region of $265 million worldwide, which was the lowest grossing MCU film for years, possibly still is at the lower end. It featured the post-credits scene where Tony Stark shows up at a bar to talk to General Ross about putting a team together, which was improvised on set without a script. But the real reason? The Incredible Hulk has always sat awkwardly in the MCU isn't the film itself, it's the rights situation. Marvel Studios owns the distribution rights to any solo Hulk film. Universal held the distribution rights in the early 2000s before Marvel Studios regained the film rights in 2005. Marvel can use the character in ensemble pieces, Avengers films, team-ups, supporting roles in other people's movies. But if they want to make a standalone Hulk film, Universal has to be involved in distributing it. And so far, no standalone Hulk film has been made since 2008. Mark Ruffalo's Bruce Banner has been a major MCU presence for over a decade, and he has not had a solo film. Not one. The character has been in roughly 10 films at this point, and still no proper standalone. It's one of the strangest gaps in the franchise. So that's the structural reason there hasn't been more Hulk. But the more interesting story, the one that genuinely fits in an Iceberg video, is the Edward Norton situation. Norton was, in the late 2000s, one of the most respected dramatic actors of his generation. American History X, Primal Fear, Fight Club, The Lot. When Marvel cast him as Bruce Banner, it was a serious bit of casting. The expectation was that he'd lend the film a kind of dramatic gravity that superhero cinema didn't normally have. What happened during production is hard to fully verify from the outside, but the broad outline is this. Norton wanted a darker, more mythic, more psychologically heavy version of the Hulk. He apparently rewrote large portions of the script. He was, by various accounts, deeply involved in shaping the film at every stage. The studio wanted something more franchise-friendly, more commercially digestible, and more cooperative with the broader plans they were starting to build. The relationship apparently became strained during post-production, when Norton and the studio disagreed about the final cut of the film. Norton wanted a longer, more contemplative version. Marvel wanted a tighter, action-forward one. The version that hit cinemas was closer to Marvel's vision than Norton's. When The Avengers was being prepared for production in 2010, Marvel made the decision not to bring Norton back. Kevin Feige released a public statement that has become slightly infamous in the years since. He said the studio needed an actor who embodies the creativity and collaborative spirit of our other talent, which is the kind of thing you only say in public when you very specifically want to make a point. Norton's representatives pushed back. They suggested the comment was unfair and that Norton had been more than cooperative. But the casting was done. Mark Ruffalo replaced him, and the franchise moved on. There's a fun fact, or maybe a not so fun fact, from a book that came out a few years ago called MCU, The Reign of Marvel Studios, written by Joanna Robinson and a few co-authors. The book reports that when Marvel was assembling the Multiverse Saga and casting their net wide for returning actors, bringing back Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, bringing back Patrick Stewart's Professor X, eventually bringing back, basically, the entire Fox X-Men roster. There were 2 people on Kevin Feige's apparent never-call list. Edward Norton was one of them. The other was Joss Whedon. Robinson's phrasing was that everyone in MCU history was on Feige's call list, except Edward Norton and Whedon. That's a strong sentence. It suggests something more lasting than a creative disagreement on one film. Whether that's accurate or whether things might change in the future, I genuinely don't know. But as of the books and reporting that exist, Norton's MCU door appears to be politely but firmly shut. What's funny, and I do mean a quietly amusing kind of funny, is how much of the Incredible Hulk has actually come back into the MCU through other channels. The film introduced Liv Tyler as Betty Ross, William Hurt as General Thaddeus Ross, Tim Roth as Emil Blonsky, who becomes the Abomination, and Tim Blake Nelson as Samuel Stearns. For years, almost none of these characters appeared anywhere else. Then in 2021, Tim Roth shows up in Shang-Chi as Abomination, in a basement fight club, having apparently been broken out of prison at some point off-screen. In 2022, he turns up again in She-Hulk as a sort of spiritual mentor figure who runs a wellness retreat for villains. In Captain America: Brave New World, in 2025, William Hurt's General Ross, recast as Harrison Ford after Hurt's passing, becomes a major plot driver, and Liv Tyler returns as Betty Ross for the first time since 2008. And Samuel Stearns, who at the end of The Incredible Hulk had a small puddle of gamma-irradiated blood spreading across his forehead, finally pays off as the leader in that same New World Order film. Which means, oddly, that The Incredible Hulk has become more canonically important to the MCU now than it was when it came out. The film that almost nobody watches has slowly been reabsorbed into the ongoing story, character by character, until you can't really write the MCU's recent history without referring back to it. The 2008 film just keeps quietly mattering more. What this leaves us with is a strange situation. Mark Ruffalo is the Hulk. He has been for nearly 15 years now. Edward Norton is reportedly blacklisted. Universal held the distribution rights. And the film that started it all is the awkward Schrodinger's MCU entry. Canon when convenient, ignored when not, and slowly getting more important as the franchise circles back to its own beginnings, looking for ways forward. I find that whole arrangement quietly fascinating. It's the most consequential recasting in the franchise's history, and I really don't think people talk about it enough. There's a whole alternate timeline MCU where Edward Norton is in the Avengers, and what does that even look like? He's a more dramatic actor than Ruffalo. He probably doesn't do the "I'm always angry" line. The film probably isn't as funny. Hard to say if it's better or worse, just different. Anyway, that's the Hulk situation. There are a few more recastings and cancelled projects worth talking about, and we'll get to those next. Some of them are stranger than the Norton story. Some are sadder. Most of them are just oddly contingent in the way that everything in this franchise tends to be. Right, here's one to start with. Edgar Wright spent roughly 8 years of his life developing an Ant-Man film for Marvel. He started working on it in around 2006, before Iron Man was even out. He co-wrote the screenplay with Joe Cornish. He directed test footage that Marvel showed at Comic-Con 2012 to convince people they were serious about making Ant-Man into a viable film. And then in May 2014, less than 3 months before filming was supposed to start, Edgar Wright left the project. The official line from both sides was creative differences. The film he was making and the film Marvel wanted to make had drifted too far apart, and at some point the distance became unbridgeable. Wright walked away, Peyton Reed stepped in, and the version of Ant-Man that hit cinemas in 2015 was, by most accounts, a very different film from the one Wright had been planning for nearly a decade. The Edgar Wright version, from what's been described in interviews over the years, was apparently stranger, more comedic, more visually playful, and considerably less interested in being a connective piece of the broader MCU. Wright wanted to make an Ant-Man film. Marvel needed an Ant-Man film that set up the broader Phase 3 rollout. Those two goals were not the same goal. 8 years of development, and the version that almost was just quietly disappeared. I've always thought that's a slightly sad story. 8 years is a long time to spend on something that doesn't get made. Now, a slightly more uncomfortable recasting story. Terrence Howard was the original James Rhodes, Rhodey, Tony Stark's best friend, and eventual War Machine in Iron Man in 2008. He was reportedly the highest paid actor on that film at the time, more highly paid than Robert Downey Jr. himself. When negotiations started for Iron Man 2, the studio tried to reduce his salary substantially. Howard pushed back. the negotiations collapsed. He was replaced by Don Cheadle. The behind-the-scenes details of how this went down are reportedly less than flattering to Marvel. There's a quote that has followed the company for years, attributed to the then chief executive of Marvel Entertainment, that black actors could be interchangeable for casting purposes. I'm not going to get into the details of that here, because the man who supposedly said it has his own section coming up, and we'll talk about him properly there. What I will say is that the Terrence Howard recasting is one of the few moments in MCU history that genuinely doesn't have a clean defense. Howard himself has talked about it in interviews over the years, and it sounds like it was a frustrating and ugly experience for him. Don Cheadle, to be fair, has been excellent in the role and has now played Rhodey for almost 16 years. But the way the changeover happened is one of the franchise's quieter low points. A nicer story, sort of. Patty Jenkins was originally hired to direct Thor: The Dark World in 2011. She would have been the first woman to direct an MCU film, years before Anna Boden co-directed Captain Marvel. The reports at the time said she left over creative differences with the studio. Natalie Portman, who had been excited to work with Jenkins on the film, was reportedly so frustrated by Jenkins' departure that her relationship with Marvel cooled for several years. Portman didn't come back to the franchise until Thor: Love and Thunder in 2022. Jenkins, of course, went on to direct Wonder Woman for Warner Brothers in 2017, which became one of the most successful superhero films of that decade. There's a parallel universe somewhere where Jenkins' Thor: The Dark World is actually good, instead of being widely regarded as one of the weaker MCU entries. We'll never know. Both Jenkins and Portman did fine in the end. Marvel got a less interesting Thor film, and DC got Wonder Woman. Honestly, fair trade for them. Joaquin Phoenix was very nearly Doctor Strange. The talks, by all accounts, were serious. Phoenix met with Marvel multiple times. There were reports in summer 2014 that he was effectively the studio's first choice for the role. What broke the deal, depending on which version you believe, was either Phoenix's reluctance to commit to a multi-film contract. Marvel typically asks actors for somewhere between 6 and 9 film commitments, or some specific creative concerns he had about the direction of the franchise. Either way, the talks fell apart. Marvel moved on to Benedict Cumberbatch, who has now played Doctor Strange in roughly 5 films and is one of the more reliable supporting players in the modern MCU. Phoenix went on to play the Joker in 2019, won an Oscar for it, and is therefore probably fine with how things shook out. But it's a strange thing to think about. The Doctor Strange we have is so specifically Cumberbatch, the voice, the bearing, the slightly theatrical line readings, that imagining Joaquin Phoenix in the role does sort of break your brain a little. Hugo Weaving, who played Red Skull in the first Avenger, is another one. Weaving was the original Red Skull and was apparently contracted for further appearances. When Marvel approached him about returning, the negotiations broke down over money and over Weaving's own creative disinterest. He had played the role once. He didn't particularly want to play it again. The character was eventually brought back in Avengers: Infinity War as the Guardian of the Soul Stone on Vormir, but the actor in the makeup was Ross Marquand, not Weaving. Marquand is best known for his work on The Walking Dead and for being a remarkable vocal impressionist. His Red Skull is, by design, a very accurate impression of Weaving's Red Skull. They didn't try to make it different. They just used a different actor and a similar performance, and most viewers didn't notice, which says something about the franchise's relationship with continuity. It says something about audiences too. Most of us aren't really watching that closely. The Inhumans situation is one I always think about with a bit of sadness. There was, at one point, a major Inhumans feature film scheduled in Phase 3. Marvel was very keen on the Inhumans for a while, partly because they didn't own the X-Men rights yet, and the Inhumans were a similar enough concept that they could function as a kind of replacement, a group of super-powered beings with their own society and politics. The film was announced, a release date was scheduled, and then over the course of a year or two, the project quietly evaporated. The film was cancelled. The concept was demoted to a television series on ABC. The TV series, when it aired in 2017, was a critical and commercial disaster. 8 episodes, mostly forgotten, with a cast that included Anson Mount as Black Bolt and Iwan Rheon as Maximus. The show was so quietly disowned that Marvel doesn't really treat it as canon anymore. Or, well, they acknowledge its existence as part of the MCU through official sources like the MCU Wiki. Anson Mount eventually came back as Black Bolt for a brief appearance in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, but as a variant from a different universe, which let the franchise sort of acknowledge the show without committing to it. The Sinister Six film is another good one. Sony, back in 2013, was developing a Spider-Man spin-off focused on Spider-Man's villain team. Drew Goddard was attached to direct. The script was reportedly well along, and then The Amazing Spider-Man 2 underperformed, and the entire plan for Sony's standalone Spider-Man universe collapsed. The Sinister Six film never happened in that form. Some of its DNA, as it turned out, ended up in Spider-Man. No Way Home, years later, the idea of bringing together multiple Spider-Man villains, the Lizard, Dr. Octopus, Electro, Sandman. That came from somewhere, and the Sinister Six development is at least partly where it came from. It's one of those cancelled projects that didn't actually die. It just got reabsorbed into the franchise's bloodstream and surfaced again under a different name. There are dozens more of these. Cancelled scripts, recast roles, projects that almost happened. The MCU has, over its run, accumulated a kind of shadow filmography of projects that didn't quite make it. Some of them might still get made, in some form, eventually. Most of them won't. What I find quietly nice about all of this is how comfortable Marvel apparently is with letting things go. Edgar Wright's Ant-Man, Patty Jenkins's Thor, Joaquin Phoenix's Doctor Strange, the original Sinister Six. None of those things happened. Marvel made other things instead. The other things mostly worked. The path the franchise actually took was just one possible path through an enormous tree of possible paths, and most of the alternative branches just got pruned and quietly composted. Now, the corporate side, this is going to be a slightly heavier section, because the person at the centre of it shaped a lot of what we've already talked about. So at the Iron Man premiere in 2008, a man turned up in costume. Not like a fan in a Captain America outfit. The chief executive of Marvel Entertainment, the company that produced the film, allegedly came to the premiere wearing a disguise. The reason, depending on which version you believe, was that he was so private and so allergic to being photographed that he didn't want anyone to recognize him on the red carpet for a film his own company had just released. His name was Isaac Perlmutter, known to everyone as Ike, and for about 4 years he was probably the single most consequential person in Marvel's corporate structure who almost nobody outside the industry had ever heard of. Perlmutter is, by all accounts, an unusual figure. He was born in Mandatory Palestine in 1942, served in the Israeli Defense Forces during the Six-Day War, emigrated to America, and made his fortune in a series of toy and entertainment investments throughout the 1980s and 1990s. He bought into Marvel during the bankruptcy era we talked about earlier, the 1996 collapse, and by the late 1990s had become the chief executive of the reorganized company. When Disney bought Marvel in 2009 for somewhere around $4 billion, Perlmutter stayed on as the head of Marvel Entertainment, with Marvel Studios sitting underneath him in the corporate structure. Kevin Feige reported to him. Every Marvel film that came out between 2008 and 2015 was made, at least technically, under Perlmutter's oversight. The thing about Perlmutter, and I'm trying to be fair here because there are multiple versions of his reputation depending on who you ask, is that he was famously cheap. Famously, almost cartoonishly cheap. There are stories about him reusing office stationery, taking paper clips from press junkets, that sort of thing. The thrift extended to film production. Marvel under Perlmutter had some of the tightest budgets in major Hollywood blockbuster cinema. The earliest MCU films, Iron Man and The Incredible Hulk and so on, were made for considerably less than their DC equivalents over at Warner Brothers. Part of that was good cost management. Part of it was Perlmutter's deeply held belief that every dollar spent on a film should be a dollar that obviously paid back in box office returns. Operating alongside Perlmutter was a thing called the Marvel Creative Committee. This was a group of comic book professionals and Marvel Entertainment executives based in New York, who served as a kind of advisory board for the films being made in Los Angeles. The committee included people like Joe Quesada, Dan Buckley, Brian Michael Bendis, and a few others. They had genuine creative input over the early MCU films. They could push back on scripts, casting, story decisions, and in some cases they did push back, in ways that have aged remarkably poorly. Probably the most famous example is what happened on Iron Man 3. The original villain in that film, as written by Shane Black and Drew Pearce, was supposed to be a woman. Rebecca Hall had been cast in the role. The character was Maya Hansen, the scientist who'd created the Extremis virus, and in the early drafts, she was the actual mastermind behind the plot. Hall has talked about this publicly. She signed on to the film expecting to play a substantial antagonist, and then during production, the role was reduced. Hall's character became a smaller supporting figure, and the villain duties shifted over to Guy Pearce's Aldrich Killian. The reported reason from inside the studio was that a female villain wouldn't sell toys, though director Shane Black stated he never learned who specifically made the decision. The toys, as Perlmutter saw it, were where the real money was. Action figures of male villains apparently sold. Action figures of female villains apparently didn't. Whether or not that's actually true commercially, that was the logic. And so the film got rewritten. This same logic is, almost certainly, the reason Black Widow didn't get a solo film for over a decade. Natasha Romanoff was introduced in Iron Man 2 in 2010. Scarlett Johansson was the third most popular Avenger by box office and fan response throughout the early 2010s. There was clear, sustained demand for a Black Widow film. Marvel did make one. Not in Phase 1, not in Phase 2, not in Phase 3. The reasoning attributed to Perlmutter and the Creative Committee in media reports was that female-led superhero films were a commercial risk, though fact-checkers later disputed whether this fairly characterized their actual position based on the available email evidence. Toys, again, was the language used. Whether or not anyone really believed that, that's the explanation that got given. Black Widow eventually got her solo film in 2021 after Perlmutter's influence on Marvel Studios had been removed, and by then her character was already dead in the franchise's timeline. The film is, in a strange way, a kind of belated apology. Black Panther and other Marvel projects were reportedly delayed for various reasons. Perlmutter was, according to multiple sources, skeptical that either of them would be commercially viable. He's reported to have personally raised concerns about both projects. Both films, when they eventually came out, made more than $1 billion worldwide. So whatever the commercial logic was, it turned out to be wrong. But the delays cost Marvel years. Black Panther could have been a Phase 2 film. Captain Marvel could have come out before the Avengers had their first team up. The MCU, as we know it, is in some real way shaped by what Perlmutter blocked. There's a quote that's followed Marvel around for years. It's reported in multiple sources, including Bob Iger's memoir and several pieces of investigative journalism. When Terrence Howard was being replaced by Don Cheadle, the reported in-house reasoning was something along the lines of, "They all look the same." That quote has been attributed to Perlmutter. He has, as far as I can tell, never publicly denied it. Whether or not it was said in exactly those words, the broad pattern of Perlmutter's decisions during this period, opposing Black Panther, opposing Captain Marvel, opposing female and minority-led films, allegedly approving the Howard recasting on cost-cutting grounds, paints a picture that is, at best, deeply uncomfortable. The whole thing came to a head in 2015. Bob Iger, who was running Disney at the time, has talked about this fairly openly in his memoir, the ride of a lifetime. According to Iger, the relationship between Perlmutter and Feige had become, essentially, unworkable. Perlmutter was, in Iger's words, intent on firing Kevin Feige. Feige, for his part, was reportedly so frustrated that he was considering leaving Marvel entirely. There were even reports, never fully confirmed, that Feige had spoken to Warner Brothers about jumping ship. Whether that conversation actually happened, the threat was real enough that Iger had to intervene. What Iger did in 2016 was restructure the company. Marvel Studios was pulled out from under Marvel Entertainment and made into a standalone subsidiary that reported directly to Walt Disney Studios, specifically to Alan Horn, the chairman. Feige no longer answered to Perlmutter. The Marvel Creative Committee's influence over Marvel movies was eliminated. Perlmutter retained control of Marvel Entertainment, which included comics publishing, animation, television, and consumer products. But the film studio was no longer his to oversee. That single corporate decision is, I'd argue, one of the most important moments in MCU history. It's the moment the modern Marvel Studios actually began. Black Panther, Captain Marvel, the more adventurous Phase 3 projects, all of that became possible because Feige was no longer being second-guessed by a man who didn't believe those films would work. There's a slightly funny detail about the aftermath. Marvel Television, which made the Netflix shows and Agents of SHIELD and a few other projects, stayed under Perlmutter, which is part of the reason those shows always felt so isolated from the films. They were, in a corporate sense, isolated. Different building, different boss, different priorities. That separation lasted until 2019, when Disney finally folded Marvel Television back into Marvel Studios under Feige. The Netflix shows had been cancelled by then. Agents of SHIELD was winding down. The whole separate fiefdom era of Marvel TV was just gently retired. Perlmutter himself was finally laid off from his Marvel Entertainment role in March 2023 as part of a broader Disney restructuring. He kept his Disney shares for a while, used them to back an unsuccessful campaign by Nelson Peltz to claim a board seat at Disney, and then in 2024 sold off his entire Disney stake. After roughly 25 years at Marvel in various roles, he was no longer affiliated with the company. The Marvel he leaves behind is essentially unrecognizable from the one he ran. Whether you credit Perlmutter with stabilizing Marvel through its bankruptcy era, or you blame him for slowing down its creative evolution, or you do both at once, and I think both is the honest answer. He's a genuinely consequential figure in the franchise's story. One of those people whose name almost never comes up at premieres, but whose decisions are baked into everything. Anyway, speaking of decisions that got course-corrected later, let's talk about the bathrobe. There's a moment in Iron Man 3, in the second act, where the audience meets the Mandarin face-to-face for what's supposed to be a major confrontation. The film has been building towards this for 2 hours. The Mandarin is a major Iron Man villain in the comics. He has the 10 rings, he has the speeches. He's the closest thing Iron Man has to a Joker, in terms of being the iconic adversary. And the version of him in Iron Man 3, played by Ben Kingsley, has been all over the trailers. Robed, bearded, speaking in apocalyptic threats. The audience is ready for a serious villain reveal. And then Tony Stark breaks into the Mandarin's compound. He kicks down a door, and the Mandarin is in a bathrobe, scratching himself, asking for a beer. He's a drunk, drug-addled British actor named Trevor Slattery, who got hired to play a fake terrorist for a media campaign cooked up by Aldrich Killian. The Mandarin from Iron Man 3 isn't real, but the actual Mandarin, Xu Wenwu, is a real character and terrorist in the MCU universe. He's a hired actor. The villain the entire film has been promising you is a piece of theatre. That moment, when it landed in cinemas in 2013, broke something in a particular kind of Marvel fan. Not all fans, not most, but a vocal subset. The complaint was that Iron Man's most iconic comic villain had been turned into a joke, that the film had bait-and-switched audiences who'd come specifically to see the Mandarin done properly. The backlash was sustained enough that it became one of the first really visible examples of the kind of franchise management headache Marvel would eventually become very good at navigating. People were genuinely angry. Some of them stayed angry for years. I'll say where I stand on this briefly, because I do have an opinion. I think the twist is good. The whole point of Iron Man 3, structurally, is that Tony Stark spends the film terrified of a faceless boogeyman, only to discover that the boogeyman was manufactured by a man in a corporate office. The villain is the corporate guy. The performative terrorist is the misdirection. That's a smart bit of writing. Shane Black, the director, was making a slightly cynical film about the theatre of fear, and the Mandarin reveal is the load-bearing wall of that whole idea. Take it away, and you don't have Iron Man 3 anymore. You have a different and worse film. Anyway, that's me. Plenty of people disagree, and that's fine. What Marvel did in response is worth looking at, because it tells you something about how the studio handles its own creative decisions over the long term. They didn't apologise exactly. They didn't retcon the twist out of canon. They didn't have a press tour saying, "Oops, our bad." What they did was much more subtle. They released a short film called All Hail the King, which we've talked about already, so I won't get back into it. And they planted a seed. The seed was that the Mandarin was real. Trevor Slattery had stolen the name from someone, and that someone was angry. The seed sat there for years. Most fans forgot about it. And then, in 2021, the seed bloomed in the form of Shang-Chi and the legend of the Ten Rings. Shang-Chi did a fascinating thing with the Mandarin character. It introduced a Chinese actor, Tony Leung, as Xu Wenwu, the leader of the Ten Rings organization, and the man who actually wielded the Ten Rings of mystical power. The film carefully avoided calling him the Mandarin in any consistent way. The character explicitly says that the Mandarin was a name invented by Aldrich Killian for his fake terrorist puppet, and that Wenwu has never used it. This is a clever bit of footwork. It lets Marvel introduce the real version of the comic character, the powerful mythic, ancient warlord with the Ten Rings, while distancing him entirely from the racist caricature the comic Mandarin originally was. The original Mandarin in 1960s Marvel Comics is, frankly, a Fu Manchu pastiche, and there's no graceful way to bring that character into a modern film as written. Marvel solved the problem by inventing a new version of him, with a different name, played by one of the greatest actors in modern cinema, and quietly retired the older, more problematic version. What I find interesting about this is the slow patience of it. The Iron Man 3 twist happened in 2013. The real Mandarin properly arrived in 2021. That's 8 years. A studio in a bigger hurry would have either doubled down on the twist or rushed out a course correction within a year or two. Marvel waited. They put little markers down. The All Hail the King short, the establishment of the Ten Rings as an actual organisation in Iron Man and other early films. And they let the pieces sit until they had the right film to bring them all together. By the time Shang-Chi came out, the original backlash was old news. Most fans had moved on. The film could just be itself, rather than having to function as a corrective. That's a more graceful version of franchise management than most studios manage. There's a pattern here that's worth noticing. Marvel does this kind of slow course correction quite often. The Sokovia Accords, for instance, were a massive plot point in Captain America: Civil War in 2016. The entire premise of that film is that the international community wants to regulate enhanced individuals, and the Avengers split over whether to comply. By the time the franchise got to Endgame and the Multiverse Saga, the Accords were almost never mentioned again. They didn't get formally repealed in any film. They just quietly stopped being relevant. Marvel let them fade. I don't think that's lazy storytelling necessarily. I think it's more like the franchise treating its own continuity as something that can be selectively honoured. The bits that work get kept, the bits that don't get to a dignified retirement. The 5-year time skip in Endgame is another one. After the snap, half of all life was gone for 5 years. People had moved on, started new relationships, accepted the loss. Then everyone came back. Logically, the social and emotional fallout of that should have been seismic. a major thread the franchise wrestled with for years. In practice, Spider-Man: Far From Home addressed it throughout the film with mostly comedic exposition, and then the MCU quietly let it go. Subsequent films treat the post-snap world as essentially normal. It's not that the trauma never happened, it's that the franchise found it more useful to acknowledge it lightly than to keep working through it. Trevor Slattery, by the way, came back in Shang-Chi as a supporting comic relief character. He's apparently been kept alive in a hidden Ten Rings facility for years, mostly because he's entertaining and nobody's bothered to kill him. He's still alive in the MCU as we speak. He's one of those tertiary characters who has now appeared in 3 separate pieces of Marvel content and might keep showing up in things. I find that very funny. The Bathrobe Man, the punchline of the most controversial twist in Phase 2, has become an enduring character. Marvel apparently quite likes him. And while we're on this topic, there's one other small course correction worth mentioning, which is the way the Abomination came back. Emil Blonsky, played by Tim Roth, was the villain of the 2008 Hulk film. The film, as we've covered, became the MCU's awkward outlier. For years, the character existed only in that film. Then he appears in Shang-Chi as an underground cage fighter. Then he turns up in She-Hulk as a spiritual guru who runs a wellness retreat for villains and is genuinely lovely to everyone. The reframing is total. Same actor, same character, same backstory, completely different vibe. Marvel doesn't apologize for the original Incredible Hulk film, exactly. They just keep bringing pieces of it back in a slightly different key, until the original feels less like a separate thing and more like an earlier movement in the same song. This is, I think, one of the franchise's quieter strengths. The willingness to revisit, the patience to wait years before paying off a thread, the comfort with letting things just fade if they don't work. It's not always graceful, but it's more graceful than most franchises manage. Anyway, speaking of long-running revisions, there's a separate negotiation that's been going on for nearly 3 decades, and is somehow still not finished. That's where we're going next. You know what's strange? Spider-Man's film rights have been actively contested or renegotiated in recent years, particularly following failed negotiations in 2019. The character first hit cinemas properly in 2002, and basically, every 5 to 7 years since then, there's been a new round of negotiations, deals, breakups, and reconciliations between the various studios involved. Most franchise characters get one home and stay there. Spider-Man has been more like a child of divorce, moving between houses depending on which parent's lawyers won the last round of court. We're going to walk through the whole saga because it's quietly one of the most interesting business stories in modern cinema. The original deal goes back to the late 1990s. Marvel, as we've established, was bankrupt. Spider-Man was even then their single most valuable character. Sony Pictures bought the film rights for somewhere in the region of $10 to $15 million in 1999. Various reports have suggested the figure was a bit higher or lower, but 7 is the number that gets cited most often. Sony got Spider-Man and a long list of related characters: Venom, the Sinister Six, basically the entire Spider-Man supporting cast. The deal had specific expiration points and required renegotiation, with conditions including a requirement that Sony release a new Spider-Man film every 575 years to maintain certain rights. Sony had to keep making Spider-Man films, otherwise the rights would revert to Marvel. As long as they were actively producing a new Spider-Man movie every 5 years, they could keep the rights as long as they wanted. Sam Raimi made his trilogy between 2002 and 2007. The first 2 films are widely considered among the best superhero films ever made. The third one is, depending on who you ask, either a misunderstood mess or just a mess, but commercially it did fine. Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker became the defining version of the character for a generation. Sony made a great deal of money. There were plans for a Spider-Man 4 and a Sinister Six film, and a whole expanded universe. Then in 2010, Raimi walked away over creative disagreements about the direction of Spider-Man 4, and Sony pivoted to a reboot. The Amazing Spider-Man with Andrew Garfield came out in 2012. It's a perfectly fine film. The sequel, in 2014, is widely regarded as a substantial misstep. The reception was widely criticised, the box office underperformed Sony's expectations and the planned expanded universe. The Sinister Six film, the Venom film, the Black Cat and Silver Sable spin-off faced significant obstacles. Sony was in trouble with their most valuable franchise, and they were looking for a way to reset. Then came the Sony email leaks. In late 2014, hackers, most analysts believed it was North Korea, in retaliation for the Seth Rogen film, The Interview, broke into Sony Pictures email servers and dumped enormous quantities of internal correspondence onto the internet. Among the emails were detailed discussions about the Spider-Man franchise, including conversations between Sony executives and Marvel about potentially collaborating on the character. The emails revealed that Marvel had been quietly negotiating with Sony for some time about whether Spider-Man could be incorporated into the MCU. The negotiations were sensitive and probably wouldn't have become public when they did without the leak. But once they were out in the open, both studios had to either commit or walk away. What they did in February 2015 was announce a deal. Marvel Studios would produce a new Spider-Man film in partnership with Sony, with Kevin Feige co-producing. Spider-Man would be allowed to appear in MCU films. Sony would keep distribution rights and final say over the character's standalone films. The financial terms were, by all accounts, fairly lopsided. Marvel received about 5% of the box office from the new Spider-Man films, plus all the merchandising rights. Sony got Marvel's creative oversight and the prestige of having Spider-Man tied into the biggest film franchise in the world. Tom Holland was cast within a few months. The story of his casting is genuinely charming. He'd been doing acrobatic moves for the audition tapes, including a side flip he did in front of Robert Downey Jr. He was about 18 at the time. He found out he got the part by reading about it on Marvel's official website, which is apparently how he learned he had been cast. He didn't get a phone call, he read it online. His Spider-Man debuted in Captain America: Civil War in 2016 in a sequence that ran about 30 minutes and became one of the most beloved character introductions in MCU history. Spider-Man. Homecoming came out in 2017, Far From Home in 2019. Both were major hits, the arrangement was working, and then in August 2019, the whole thing nearly fell apart. Disney by then was the parent company of Marvel and was paying for Marvel's creative work on the films, while only getting 5% of the box office back. The terms felt increasingly unbalanced. Disney went back to Sony with a new proposal: 50-50 financing, 50-50 profits going forward. Sony refused. The two sides hit an impasse. The deal collapsed publicly. There were reports that Spider-Man would be leaving the MCU. The fan reaction was enormous. There were online campaigns. There were panels at the D23 Expo where the response from the room when Marvel didn't have Spider-Man news was, by all accounts, palpable disappointment. And according to multiple sources, Tom Holland himself made personal phone calls to Bob Iger at Disney and to Tom Rothman at Sony separately, pleading with both of them to find a way to keep him in the MCU. Holland has talked about this in interviews. He was apparently quite emotional about it. He'd built his career around playing this character in this version of the franchise, and the idea that the partnership was ending was genuinely upsetting to him. What happened next is one of those things that suggests how much individual relationships still matter in this business, even at the scale we're talking about. Disney and Sony went back to the table. The new deal that emerged was a compromise. Disney would co-finance about 25% of the next Spider-Man film and receive about 25% of the profits. Marvel kept its creative role. Spider-Man would stay in the MCU for at least one more film, with options for more. Tom Holland's personal intervention is generally credited with helping push the negotiations back open. Whether that's how it really went is impossible to verify from outside, but it's the story that has stuck. The result of the new deal was Spider-Man: No Way Home, which came out in late 2021 and quietly became one of the highest-grossing films of all time. It brought back Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield as their respective versions of Peter Parker, along with the major villains from their respective franchises. The film functioned as a kind of multiverse reunion. It also resolved Tom Holland's first trilogy by having a spell that made the entire world forget Peter Parker exists, which means his version of the character now operates in the MCU without any of the supporting cast knowing him. A neat narrative reset, conveniently aligned with whatever business arrangement Sony and Marvel might want next. The next film in the Tom Holland run is called Spider-Man: Brand New Day. Scheduled for release in 2026, it's being co-produced by Sony and Marvel under what is presumably yet another renegotiated version of the deal. The details of the current arrangement haven't been fully disclosed publicly, but the basic structure appears to remain similar to the post-2019 agreement. Meanwhile, Sony has been doing their own thing on the side. They have what they call Sony's Spider-Man universe, a parallel film franchise based on Spider-Man characters who don't include Spider-Man himself. Venom got a trilogy with Tom Hardy that did very well commercially. Morbius came out and is mostly remembered now as a meme. Madame Web came out and was widely panned. Kraven the Hunter came out and similarly underperformed. The Sony side films have had a wobbly track record. There have been recurring rumours that Tom Holland might cross over into one of them. There was even a fairly serious discussion about a Venom and Spider-Man crossover, which Tom Hardy has confirmed in interviews, but it has never materialised. What I think is genuinely interesting about the whole Spider-Man saga is how much of it is still actively in motion. The current deal is not the final deal. There will be another negotiation, probably within a few years, and another version of the arrangement after that. Spider-Man's film rights are settled. Sony holds exclusive film rights. They have been renegotiated on numerous occasions over the past 25 years. They probably never will be settled in any final locked-in way. The character is too valuable, too contested, and too entangled in two separate film universes for either studio to ever fully let go. It's an ongoing thing, a long, slow tug-of-war that has somehow produced some of the best superhero films ever made along the way. Now, on the topic of MCU side projects that had their own complicated relationship with the main timeline, let's talk about the Netflix shows. In April 2015, 3 years after the Avengers had defined what Marvel cinema looked like, bright, witty, family-friendly, full of quips, Marvel released the first season of Daredevil on Netflix, and it opened on a brutal blood-soaked alley fight that ends with a man having his face caved in against a car door. It was, by some considerable distance, the darkest thing the MCU had ever produced. It was also a properly excellent piece of television, and a lot of casual Marvel fans, the ones who'd come to the franchise through Iron Man and Thor, never watched it. Either because Netflix wasn't where they expected to find Marvel, or because the tonal shift was too jarring, or because they just didn't realise it counted. The Netflix shows occupy a strange tier of the MCU Iceberg. They were officially Marvel productions. They were produced under the Marvel Television banner. They existed in the same continuity as the films, and yet they felt, from the start, like they were taking place in a slightly different universe. The films were globe-spanning and cosmic. The Netflix shows were grounded, neighbourhood-level, almost pulpy. Most of the films were PG-13. The Netflix shows had on-screen violence that, on a major network, would have been considered explicit. They were the gritty, street-level Marvel, made for adults, and they were doing something genuinely different. There were 6 shows in total. Daredevil ran for 3 seasons from 2015 to 2018. Jessica Jones, with Kristen Ritter in one of the best performances in any superhero adaptation, ran from 2015 to 2019. Luke Cage with Mike Colter ran from 2016 to 2018. Iron Fist with Finn Jones ran from 2017 to 2018. The Defenders, which brought all 4 characters together for a single 8-episode crossover, came out in 2017. And The Punisher with John Bernthal in what is, frankly, the definitive screen version of Frank Castle, ran from 2017 to 2019. The connective tissue between the Netflix shows and the films was always thin and a little awkward. There were occasional references to The Incident, which is how the New York-based shows talked about the Battle of New York from the first Avengers film. There were shared characters in the form of Trish Walker's mention of Captain America comics, or Foggy Nelson making jokes about the Sokovia Accords. Carrie-Anne Moss's Jerry Hogarth was a lawyer in the Daredevil universe and appeared in the Netflix series, sort of, in the kind of way that you'd miss if you blinked. The shows were eventually confirmed as part of MCU canon after initially having ambiguous canonical status. They lived in the same New York City as Tony Stark and Peter Parker, but they almost never directly interacted with the film characters, and the film characters almost never acknowledged them. The reason for that separation is the corporate thing we talked about in the Perlmutter section. Marvel Television and Marvel Studios were structurally separate operations. Different leadership, different priorities, different budgets. The film side and the TV side had a kind of polite distance from each other that wasn't quite hostility, but wasn't really collaboration either. The "It's all connected" tagline that Marvel used in marketing during the mid-2010s was, in practice, partially true. The shows are canon. They were just allowed to exist in a corner of the canon that the films didn't have to engage with. What I think made the Netflix shows so creatively successful, and they are, despite some unevenness, mostly excellent, is exactly that distance. The showrunners had room to make their own decisions. Daredevil, under Steven DeKnight, and later Eric Olson, developed a tone and aesthetic that was completely unlike anything in the films. Jessica Jones, under Melissa Rosenberg, did some of the bravest writing about trauma and abuse that any superhero adaptation has ever attempted. The Punisher, under Steve Lightfoot, took a one-dimensional revenge character from the films and turned him into a properly tragic figure. The shows had room because nobody was paying that much attention from the top, and they used that room well. The shows also had constraints, mind you. The budgets were, by film standards, fairly tight. The visual effects were often limited to relatively grounded sequences. There's no Daredevil battling a cosmic threat because Daredevil's whole appeal is hallway fights filmed in long takes. The casts were, with one or two exceptions, not headline names. The whole production model was Netflix's prestige TV model from the mid-2010s, which meant 10 or 13 episode seasons with specific narrative shapes and specific running times. Some of those seasons got bloated. Luke Cage's second season, Iron Fist's first season, the back half of The Defenders. These are not perfect pieces of television. But the best of the shows, and Daredevil's third season in particular, are genuinely among the strongest superhero adaptations ever made. Netflix began to cancel the shows in 2018 and 2019 when Disney announced that they were building their own streaming service, Disney Plus, which launched in 2019, and that Marvel content would be moving to that platform. Netflix and Disney parted ways. The shows were cancelled, one by one, across late 2018 and 2019. There was a contractual 2-year embargo on the characters appearing anywhere else, which is why Charlie Cox couldn't be seen as Daredevil in any Marvel project until late 2021. When that embargo expired, things started moving quickly. Charlie Cox showed up in Spider-Man: No Way Home in December 2021 as Matt Murdock in a small but warmly received cameo. He came back in She-Hulk in 2022 in a cameo role. He came back again in Echo in 2024, this time alongside Vincent D'Onofrio as Wilson Fisk. Fisk himself, the Kingpin, had also returned earlier, first in Hawkeye in 2021, then in Echo, then in his own full Daredevil revival series. The reintegration of the Netflix characters into the main MCU happened gradually and almost without fanfare. Marvel didn't make a big deal about whether the original shows were canon. They just brought the actors back, kept their performances consistent with the original shows, and let viewers draw their own conclusions. Then came Daredevil, Born Again, which had a difficult production. The original plan was an 18-episode revival series that would function as a legal procedural, which was later revamped with a more action-oriented and different tonal approach. By the time the writers' strike halted production in May 2023, they shut down Blade before filming even started, citing the ongoing writers' strike rather than concerns about the project itself. There was a major creative overhaul. New showrunner came in. Roughly half the existing footage was reshot or restructured. The episode count was cut down to 9 for the first season. Dario Scardapane, who had worked on The Punisher, was brought in to steer the project. The second season was confirmed at D23 in August 2024, with 8 episodes carried over from what had originally been an 18-episode arc. The show that finally aired when it did was much closer in spirit to the original Netflix Daredevil than to whatever Marvel had initially planned. The whole Netflix era reintegration is, I think, one of the more interesting things the modern MCU has done. They took a body of work that was, structurally, in a corporate annex of the franchise, and they've slowly absorbed it back into the main timeline. The Netflix characters are now MCU characters. The events of the original shows are more or less treated as canon. The franchise has effectively retroactively adopted those shows as part of its main story, which means the Netflix Defenders era, Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Punisher, all of it, is, by most reasonable measures, MCU content. It just took the franchise about 8 years to actually start treating it that way. What I'd recommend, honestly, if you've never watched any of these, is to start with Daredevil Season 1, then watch Jessica Jones Season 1, then Daredevil Season 3, then The Punisher Season 1. That's the highlight reel. The rest is a more variable, but still mostly worthwhile experience. Either way, they're a real part of the MCU now. And the recent revival, with Charlie Cox properly back as Daredevil in his own series, is some of the most exciting work the franchise has produced in years. Anyway, speaking of Marvel revivals after a long quiet, let's talk about what happened to the franchise during the pandemic. The next phase of the MCU was supposed to launch with Black Widow in May 2020, Scarlett Johansson's belated solo film, a prequel to Endgame, the reset that would carry the franchise through to whatever came next. The film didn't come out in May 2020. The world had, by then, shut down. Cinemas were closed, productions were paused. Marvel, like every other studio, was stuck waiting to see what would happen. The big plan for the post-Endgame transition just sort of stopped mid-step. What Marvel did with the gap, and this turned out to be more consequential than anyone realised at the time, was pivot a substantial portion of their output to Disney+. The streaming service had launched in November 2019. It had Marvel content from the start, old films, the various Disney+ exclusive shows that had been announced, but Marvel hadn't yet released any major new property on the platform. The pandemic forced the question. Black Widow eventually came out, but in July 2021, more than a year later, and on a hybrid theatre and Disney+ release that triggered a lawsuit which we'll talk about further down the iceberg. Before any of that, the first proper Phase 4 MCU release was a thing called WandaVision, which dropped in January 2021. It was a television show. It was weird, and it absolutely was not what anyone expected. WandaVision is, in my opinion, one of the best things the MCU has ever produced. Probably top 5, depending on what mood you're in. The premise is that Wanda Maximoff, grieving the loss of Vision, has somehow constructed a fake suburban reality in a small town in New Jersey, where she and Vision are married and living out the various decades of American sitcom history. The first episode is a black and white 1950s sitcom pastiche. The second is a 1960s sitcom pastiche. The show progresses decade by decade, through I Love Lucy and The Dick Van Dyke Show, and The Brady Bunch, and Family Ties, and Modern Family. Behind the gradually changing aesthetic, the actual plot is a story about a woman who has lost her partner and is desperately trying to build a world where she didn't. The show received a low critical reception, with a 16% score on Rotten Tomatoes. It was strange enough, formally ambitious enough, and emotionally specific enough to feel like a major creative statement. Audiences had genuinely never seen the MCU do anything like it. The week-to-week release schedule, where new episodes dropped every Friday, encouraged a kind of obsessive fan speculation that the franchise hadn't really generated before. People were making theories. People were dissecting frames. The show became a cultural moment in a way that Disney Plus MCU content hasn't quite recaptured since. It also generated what is, looking back, one of the funniest fan theory crashes in modern blockbuster history: the Mephisto theory. As the show progressed and various pieces of weirdness piled up, a strange beekeeper character, a mysterious aerospace contractor named Hayward, hints of cosmic-level magic, fans collectively decided that the secret villain pulling the strings had to be Mephisto, the demonic Marvel Comics character. Mephisto is the closest thing Marvel has to a Satan figure, and in the comics, he has a long history with Scarlet Witch, including in some particularly famous storylines. The theory became so widespread that in the lead-up to the finale, mainstream entertainment journalists were treating Mephisto's eventual appearance as basically inevitable. They were writing previews of him. They were speculating about which actor would play him. People were genuinely confident. Mephisto was not in the show. The actual villain of WandaVision turned out to be Agatha Harkness, played beautifully by Kathryn Hahn, who got her own catchy musical reveal and her own eventual spin-off series years later. There was no Mephisto. There was never going to be a Mephisto. The theory had been a piece of group mind speculation that had built itself up into an apparent certainty without any actual evidence beyond a few visual cues that turned out to mean something different. When the finale aired and Mephisto didn't show up, there was a fascinating collective recalibration online. The fans who'd been most confident had to publicly walk it back. Mephisto has continued to be teased, more recently in Agatha All Along, which is the Agatha Harkness spin-off that aired in 2024. He still has not appeared. Whether he ever will is unclear. After WandaVision, Marvel went on a Disney Plus run that, in retrospect, was almost certainly too much content too quickly. Falcon and the Winter Soldier came out in March 2021, 6 episodes of action-adventure television that picked up Sam Wilson's transition into Captain America. Loki dropped in June 2021, which introduced the Time Variance Authority, the concept of multiversal variance, and a character called He Who Remains, who turned out to be a Kang variant in disguise. We'll get to the Kang stuff properly in its own section. Hawkeye came out in late 2021. Moon Knight, Ms. Marvel, She-Hulk all rolled out across 2022. By the end of that year, Marvel had released somewhere in the region of 8 series on Disney Plus in less than 2 years, alongside multiple films. The discourse around what people started calling MCU fatigue really took hold around this period. The argument, which I think has some truth to it, was that the volume of content had outpaced anyone's ability to keep up. You couldn't be a casual Marvel fan anymore. To understand the films, you had to have watched the shows. To understand the shows, you had to have watched the films. The total amount of content required to follow the ongoing story was now enormous. And the production model, 6-episode prestige series produced on tight schedules with limited budgets, meant that quality varied wildly from show to show. Some of the Disney Plus series were excellent, some were merely fine. A few felt rushed in ways that the films had rarely felt rushed. The pressure on visual effects houses in particular became a serious industry concern, although we'll save the proper version of that story for the last section. Loki Season 2, which came out in late 2023, is the moment I think the Disney Plus era actually cohered properly. The first season had set up the Time Variance Authority and introduced the multiverse. The second season took those concepts and turned them into a genuinely beautiful piece of television about identity and choice and the burden of authority. The show's resolution, Loki choosing to become a kind of cosmic god, holding the timeline together by hand, alone, forever, is one of the most emotionally affecting things the MCU has ever done. I rate it very highly. It's not a series for everyone, but for the people who connect with it, it sits among the franchise's best work. The WandaVision lineage, by the way, has continued. There was Agatha All Along in 2024, the Catherine Hahn-led spin-off, which is a strange and witchy show with a different tone again, and Vision Quest, which is in development for release in 2026, will focus on Paul Bettany's vision and reportedly conclude what the franchise has started calling a WandaVision trilogy. The three shows together, WandaVision, Agatha, Vision Quest, form one of the more distinct creative islands in the modern MCU. They're not really concerned with the main superhero narrative. They're concerned with grief, magic, identity, and the strange afterlives of characters who'd been written off as supporting players. I genuinely appreciate that the franchise has space for that kind of project. The overall Disney Plus era has, I think, been creatively uneven, but at its best, brilliant. WandaVision, Loki Season 1 and 2, Moon Knight at its strongest, the Daredevil revival, some of Agatha All Along. These are projects that wouldn't have existed in the pre-2020 version of the MCU. The streaming pivot opened up creative space that the films couldn't fill. It also created some genuine problems, and we'll talk about those properly when we get to the bottom of the iceberg. For now, though, there's a different Disney Plus thread that we need to follow. The thread that started with He Who Remains in the Loki Season 1 finale. Because everything that's happened to the franchise from 2023 onwards, including the dramatic recasting of its central villain, traces back to that moment. So in the final episode of Loki Season 1, which aired in July 2021, Loki and Sylvie reach the end of time and meet a man called He Who Remains, played by Jonathan Majors. He explains the entire multiversal cosmology to them. He's a variant of a character named He Who Remains. He warns them that if he dies, his variants will return, and the variants are much worse than him. They went to war across the multiverse. Loki and Sylvie disagree about what to do. Sylvie kills him anyway. The timeline shatters, and the franchise had, in that moment, set up its next 10 years of story. The plan was clear, at least from the outside. Kang would be the new Thanos. The Multiverse Saga, which the Infinity Saga had given way to, would build across multiple films and shows towards a confrontation with Kang in his various variant forms. The two-part Avengers finale was already being titled Avengers, the Kang Dynasty, scheduled for 2025, and Avengers Secret Wars, scheduled for 2025. Jonathan Majors had been cast as the central villain of an entire era. He would play multiple Kang variants across multiple projects. He was supposed to anchor the next phase of the franchise, the way Josh Brolin had anchored the Infinity Saga. The blueprint was written. What happened next is one of the more painful stories in recent Marvel history, and I'm going to handle it carefully because there are people involved who deserve to be discussed without sensationalism. Kang's first major appearance after Loki came in Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, which came out in February 2023. The film was meant to properly launch Kang as the franchise's new big bad. The reception was underwhelming. Critics weren't keen. The box office was aligned with or exceeded Marvel's projections. Many fans found the depiction of Kang in the film less imposing than the version that had appeared at the end of Loki. There were already, before any of the off-screen drama, internal concerns at Marvel about whether the Kang storyline was working. Then in March 2023, the same month Quantumania was still in cinemas, Jonathan Majors was arrested in New York City following an incident with a partner. The case progressed through 2023, with a criminal trial in late November and December of that year. In December 2023, Majors was found guilty of 1 count of misdemeanor assault and 1 count of harassment. Within hours of the verdict, Marvel Studios announced that they had cut ties with the actor. Marvel Studios cut ties with Jonathan Majors following his late 2023 convictions, though recent statements from the actor have teased the possibility of a potential return. Reporting suggests that the decision to move away from Kang as the central Multiverse Saga villain had actually started before the conviction. The underperformance of Quantumania, the lukewarm reception, and the broader sense that the storyline wasn't catching fire all contributed to internal discussions. The conviction made the decision unavoidable. Whatever the studio had been considering about how to use Majors going forward, it was no longer on the table. The Kang Dynasty title was retired. Avengers 5 did have a villain, Doctor Doom. The studio had a problem. The original director of the Kang Dynasty, Destin Daniel Cretton, who had directed Shang-Chi, departed the project in late 2023. The writer, Jeff Loveness, who had written Quantumania, was replaced by Michael Waldron, who had been the head writer on Loki. The film was effectively being rebuilt from scratch in the second half of 2023 and into 2024, while Marvel worked out what to do about its villain problem. The solution, when it came, was one of the boldest creative decisions Marvel has made in years. In July 2024, at San Diego Comic-Con, Marvel held a Hall H panel where multiple people in Doctor Doom masks walked onto the stage. One of them removed the mask. It was Robert Downey Jr., the man who had been Iron Man, who had died in Endgame, whose character had been mourned across the franchise, was coming back to play Marvel's most iconic comic villain. The Avengers films would be called Avengers, Doomsday and Avengers, Secret Wars. The Russo brothers, who had directed Infinity War and Endgame, were returning to direct both films. Stephen McFeely, who had written those films, was returning as co-writer with Waldron. Marvel was, essentially, putting the entire Infinity Saga creative team back together to handle the saga finale. The reaction was, as you'd expect, divided. Some fans were thrilled. Robert Downey Jr. as Doctor Doom is, on paper, an extraordinary piece of casting. Doctor Doom is one of the great comic book villains, vain, brilliant, dictatorial, secretly tragic, and Downey is one of the most charismatic actors of his generation. There's a real chance the performance is going to be one of the highlights of the entire franchise. Other fans were less enthusiastic. The concern was that bringing Downey back, in a different role, less than a decade after killing his character off, would muddy the franchise's emotional stakes. If beloved characters can come back as different characters whenever the franchise needs a star, what does any death mean? It's a fair criticism. The honest answer is that Marvel has clearly decided that the box office potential of Downey in this role outweighs the narrative purity argument. Whether that decision was right is going to be a question fans argue about for years. The financial details of the deal are striking. Downey is reportedly being paid in the region of $50 million per film, with the Russo brothers receiving around $40 million each. These are blockbuster-tier paychecks, of the kind that haven't been common in mainstream Hollywood for years. Downey also negotiated specific perks: private jet travel, dedicated personal security, trailers with personal chefs on set, the sort of thing that suggests he's being treated very much as a returning superstar rather than just an actor for hire. Bonuses based on box office could reportedly double his salary if the films perform. The character was teased at the end of the Fantastic Four. First steps in 2025 in a mid-credits sequence that introduced the masked figure without showing his face properly. The Doomsday release itself, originally scheduled for May 2026, was delayed to December 2026. The exact reasons for the delay have not been officially confirmed. There were reports during production that filming began before the script was fully complete, although the cast eventually saw a finished screenplay. Filming took place at Pinewood Studios in England across the spring and summer of 2025. the film wrapped in September. Kevin Feige, by reports from Deadline and various trade outlets, has been almost solely focused on these two films for the past year, in a way reminiscent of how he handled the Infinity War and Endgame era. The Disney Plus shows have continued at a slightly slower pace. The strategy seems to be that Doomsday and Secret Wars will be the major event of the next 2 years, with everything else functioning as supporting context. Secret Wars, the second of the two films, is widely expected to function as a kind of soft reboot. There's a quote attributed to Feige in the MCU, The Reign of Marvel Studios book, that has been read as implying exactly that. That Secret Wars will allow Marvel to keep what's working, remove what isn't, and reintroduce characters audiences had thought were permanently gone. The Russos have described Secret Wars as the most ambitious project Marvel has ever attempted. Whether that bears out, we'll find out in 2027. The film is currently scheduled to begin filming in mid-2026, with a December 2027 release. The Kang situation, in retrospect, is one of the more dramatic course corrections any major film franchise has had to pull off in real time. An entire saga villain replaced, a planned multi-film arc rewritten, the studio's creative team rebuilt, and the franchise's most iconic departed actor brought back in a completely different role. It's the kind of pivot that, in a smaller franchise, would probably have caused the whole thing to collapse. Marvel has the resources and the institutional flexibility to absorb it. Whether the result is going to be brilliant or a mess, nobody can quite say yet. The bet is enormous either way. What's a little sad about the whole story is that there's a genuinely interesting Kang version of these films that simply doesn't exist now. Whatever was being planned for the Kang dynasty before the off-screen events shut it down, we'll never see it. Whatever Jonathan Majors might have brought to the role in subsequent films and shows, gone. The Kang dynasty exists now only as a discarded title and a set of abandoned concepts. The franchise moved on. That's how this kind of thing tends to go. Now, let's move down the iceberg into stranger and quieter territory. The cosmic lore that most viewers walk straight past. Right, now we're properly into the iceberg. This section is, in some ways, my favourite, because it's the bit of the franchise that I genuinely think people don't talk about enough. There is, lurking in the background of various MCU films, a substantial body of cosmic mythology that the franchise has been quietly seeding for years. Most of it is never explained directly. A lot of it just sits there, in establishing shots, in lines of dialogue most viewers don't catch, in statues in temples that the camera lingers on for half a second. If you want to feel like a person who's been paying attention, this is the tier of the iceberg where you start picking up on the things the franchise has been laying down for over a decade. Let's start with the Living Tribunal. In Doctor Strange, the 2016 film, when Strange is wandering through the Sanctum Sanctorum looking at all the strange relics and mystical objects on display, there's a moment where the camera pans past a small statue of a three-faced cosmic figure. 3 heads, 3 faces, a kind of solemn ornamental presence. Most viewers do not register it. It's on screen for a couple of seconds, and the film doesn't draw attention to it. That statue is the Living Tribunal. In Marvel Comics, the Living Tribunal is essentially the cosmic judge of all realities, a being who exists above the entire multiverse and arbitrates conflicts between realities themselves. It's one of the most powerful beings in Marvel's entire metaphysical hierarchy, and it's just sitting there in a film from 2016, decorating the background, waiting to be relevant. Whether it ever becomes properly relevant to the MCU is anyone's guess. But the statue is in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. The seed has been planted. Then there are the Watchers. The Watchers are a cosmic species of observers. They exist throughout the universe, and they watch, mostly silently, while events unfold. They have a sacred oath not to interfere. There's one specific Watcher named Uatu, who, in the comics, is the one most associated with Earth. The MCU has been quietly building Uatu in the background for years. He appears in the animated series What If, narrating each episode, voiced by Jeffrey Wright. He appears in Guardians of the Galaxy in 2014, briefly, during a sequence in the Collector's Museum where you can see a Watcher figure standing in a hallway. He's been there. The franchise just hasn't done anything major with him yet. Connected to the Watchers, and this is one of my favourite pieces of MCU fan lore, is the Stan Lee theory. Stan Lee, who co-created most of the characters in the franchise and who appeared in nearly every MCU film as a cameo until his death in 2018, was always thought of as just a fun Easter egg presence. But fans noticed over the years that his cameos sometimes seemed to share a kind of connected awareness. He'd appear in completely different settings as completely different characters, and yet there'd be little thematic continuities. The theory developed that all of Stan Lee's cameos were actually appearances by the same character. That Stan Lee was, in fact, a Watcher informant in human form, observing the events of the MCU and walking among the humans whose stories he had helped create. Marvel quietly confirmed this in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 in 2017. There's a post-credits scene where Stan Lee is sitting on an alien planet on the surface of what appears to be a rocky moon, talking to 3 Watchers. They appear to be admonishing him for some kind of breach of protocol. He's just chatting with them like it's a casual conversation. He mentions, among other things, being a FedEx delivery man once, which is a reference to his cameo in Captain America: Civil War. The scene confirms, in the lightest possible way, that all of Stan Lee's appearances across the MCU were the same person, and that person was associated with the Watchers. Whether he's a Watcher himself, or just an honorary one, is left vague, but the connection is canonical. It's a quiet, beautiful little tribute. I love it. Then there are the Celestials. The Celestials are enormous cosmic beings, humanoid in shape but the size of planets, who, in Marvel cosmology, are responsible for various acts of cosmic creation and engineering. The first proper celestial appearance in the MCU is, in fact, the entire setting of Nowhere, the mining colony in Thor, the Dark World. Gamora explains in a brief expository moment that Nowhere is built inside the severed head of a celestial. That's the actual location. They're mining a dead god. Most viewers in 2014 absorbed this as flavour and moved on. It's only with Eternals in 2021 that the franchise actually engaged with the Celestials as significant characters, with Eternals explaining that Celestials seed planets with intelligent life and harvest them for cosmic reproduction. That whole film is, in a sense, a direct expansion of the Celestials' role in MCU cosmology. Whether it landed creatively is a conversation for another day, but the seeds were planted long before the film. Eternity, the cosmic being who literally embodies the concept of existence in Marvel cosmology, made a brief but striking appearance in Thor: Love and Thunder in 2022. The film's third act involves Gore the God Butcher reaching the centre of the universe to make a wish to Eternity, who manifests as a strange humanoid energy figure made of all the colours and shapes of the cosmos. It's a brief moment. Most reviews of the film didn't dwell on it. But Eternity in the comics is one of the most powerful beings in the entire Marvel universe, and the fact that the MCU has now established that Eternity exists in this version of the cosmology is a substantial bit of mythological scaffolding for later stories. There's also the Beyonders, which is a concept that comes from the comics version of Secret Wars. In the comics, the Beyonders are nearly omnipotent beings from beyond the multiverse who, in various storylines, set up a kind of cosmic gladiatorial arena and force heroes and villains to fight for their amusement. The 2015 Secret Wars comic event involves the Beyonders setting up the collapse of the multiverse. Whether the MCU's version of Secret Wars will involve the Beyonders directly is unclear. The film hasn't been released. The trailers have been cagey, but the concept is in the source material, and it's the kind of thing the MCU could absolutely pull from if they wanted to introduce a higher-level cosmic threat. Mephisto, as we mentioned, has been teased repeatedly and has finally appeared in Ironheart. The teases continue. Agatha all along had references that fans interpreted as Mephisto-coded. Various other shows have had moments that could be read either way. The character is essentially Marvel's Satan, and he has a particularly significant comic history with the Scarlet Witch, with Spider-Man, with Doctor Strange. Whether he ever actually shows up in the MCU is the most enduring open question in the franchise's mystical lore. My honest guess is yes, eventually, in a project we don't know about yet. But guesses about Mephisto have been wrong many times before, so take that with appropriate salt. Galactus is the one cosmic figure the franchise is now properly committed to. In the Fantastic Four, First Steps, released in 2025, Galactus is the main antagonist. He's an enormous cosmic devourer of worlds, attended by the Silver Surfer, and he sets his sights on Earth as his next meal. The film handles him with surprising dignity. He's not a generic destroyer villain. He's a force of nature, indifferent to human morality, which is the version of the character that actually works dramatically. The Silver Surfer in that film is a herald-style figure who shows up to give the warning and then ends up entangled with the Fantastic Four's mission. Both characters now exist in the MCU. Galactus is a piece on the board, and Galactus is traditionally the kind of threat that the entire Avengers might need to deal with eventually, particularly in a Multiverse Saga finale. There are smaller pieces I'm not going to get into in detail because some of them are very deep cuts. Null, the King in Black, exists in the Sony Spider-Man side of things, in the Venom films, as a hinted-at cosmic threat. The Quantum Realm has its own ecology and history that Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, began to explore. The multiverse as a structural concept has now been given enough rules, courtesy of the Time Variance Authority and the events of various Doctor Strange and Loki properties, that it can support whatever cosmology the franchise needs going forward. The shape of all this is what I find genuinely cool. The MCU has, almost without anyone noticing, accumulated a complete cosmic mythology over the past decade. It's not the same as the comics version. It's adapted and simplified and reshaped for the films. But the basic hierarchy is in place. Cosmic creators at the top, cosmic observers, cosmic judges, cosmic devourers, cosmic embodiments of abstract concepts. All of it sits there in the background of various films waiting to be used. It's the kind of mythology that takes years to build and that pays off slowly over multiple stories, and the MCU has been quietly building it the whole time, mostly without making a big deal about it. Anyway, last proper section coming, the deepest part of the iceberg, where the stories get stranger and quieter and a bit darker. In July 2021, Scarlett Johansson sued Disney over the release of Black Widow. This is one of those things that hit the entertainment news cycle for about a week and then mostly disappeared from public consciousness. But it had significant consequences for how Marvel and other studios handle their releases now. Here's the short version. Johansson's contract for Black Widow apparently included compensation tied to the film's theatrical box office performance when Disney decided to release the film simultaneously in cinemas and on Disney Plus as a premium rental, a decision driven by the pandemic and the ongoing weirdness of cinema attendance. That simultaneous release reportedly cost Johansson somewhere in the region of $50 million in expected earnings, because a substantial portion of the audience watched it at home instead of in cinemas. Johansson sued. Disney initially responded with a fairly aggressive public statement defending the decision and questioning her motives. The lawsuit settled within a couple of months for an undisclosed amount, but the broader effect was lasting. Studios became substantially more careful about hybrid release strategies. Contracts started including specific language about streaming releases. The whole industry recalibrated. and Johansson, who had been a Marvel mainstay for over a decade, didn't appear in any further MCU productions for years, though she's expected to return at some point. The whole episode is a reminder that even at this scale, the franchise has had its share of bruising public disputes with its own talent. In 2022, Vulture published an investigative piece, and The Hollywood Reporter also published investigative reporting, exposing the working conditions at the visual effects houses that produce most of the MCU's effects work. The reporting was uncomfortable. Anonymous VFX artists described punishing schedules, last-minute changes that required teams to work essentially around the clock for weeks, and a general industry culture in which Marvel productions were known for being some of the most difficult to work on. The Disney Plus rapid production model, in particular, was identified as putting enormous strain on effects houses. Multiple shows would be in post-production simultaneously, all needing the same finite pool of VFX workers, all running on tight deadlines. There were reports of artists being burned out, of small studios going under because they couldn't sustain the Marvel pace, of a general race to the bottom in pricing that left workers underpaid for what was, by any reasonable standard, world-class technical work. The reports led to broader industry conversations about VFX worker organisation. Some progress has been made since then, but the underlying pressures haven't really gone away. James Gunn's story is another one. Gunn directed the first two Guardians of the Galaxy films, which are widely loved and are some of my personal favourite MCU entries. In July 2018, a series of old tweets from years before he was at Marvel, jokes that were, charitably, in extremely poor taste, resurfaced as part of an online campaign against him. Disney fired him. The decision was controversial. The cast of the Guardians films publicly defended him. Within months, Gunn had signed on to write and direct The Suicide Squad for Warner Brothers. And by March 2019, Disney had quietly rehired him to finish the Guardians trilogy. Volume 3, when it came out in 2023, completed his Marvel run. He's now running DC Studios, the rival superhero franchise at Warner Brothers, which he took over in late 2022. His departure from Marvel was amicable in the end, but the original firing was a strange moment in the franchise's history. A reminder that decisions like that can be reversed when the public response is loud enough, and that the line between cancellation and continuation can shift depending on who's defending whom. In 2021, Eternals was banned in multiple Middle Eastern countries. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait refused to release the film. The reason was the same-sex relationship between two of the Eternals. The character, Phastos, has a husband and a son, and the film depicts their family life on screen, including a brief same-sex kiss. The Marvel response was to refuse to cut the scene. Disney would not make a version of the film without the relationship. They lost the markets in those countries rather than recut the film. I think that's worth noting as a small piece of MCU history, because the franchise hasn't always been brave about these things, and on this particular question, they held the line. The Captain Marvel review bombing situation in 2019 is another one. In the weeks before the film came out, there was a coordinated campaign across various online platforms to leave negative reviews of the film, mostly motivated by what the participants felt was Brie Larson's politics. The campaign got significant enough that Rotten Tomatoes, the review aggregator, had to change their review policies. Previously, users could leave reviews of films before the films had been released. Ahead of Captain Marvel, Rotten Tomatoes started requiring films to be in cinemas before users could leave reviews. It's a small policy change, but it had broader effects across how internet movie discourse works. Agents of SHIELD is one of the stranger entries in MCU canon. The show ran for 7 seasons from 2013 to 2020 on ABC under the Marvel Television banner. Coulson, played by Clark Gregg, returned despite having died in the Avengers, a return that was explained through something called Project TAHI, which involved alien blood used to bring him back to life. The show was clearly part of the MCU in its early seasons, with tie-ins to specific films, references to ongoing events, occasional cameos from film characters. As the show progressed, the connections thinned out. By the later seasons, it was operating almost entirely on its own, telling its own stories without any meaningful film tie-ins. Marvel Studios has, in recent years, been notably ambiguous about whether Agents of SHIELD is canon. Some references suggested it could be, but Agents of SHIELD is officially not canon. Some recent productions have implied it isn't. The official position is essentially, we don't talk about it, which is a strange thing to do with a show that ran for 7 years, won industry awards, and featured beloved characters. But there it is. The show exists in a kind of canonical limbo, and the franchise doesn't seem in a hurry to resolve the question. The Howard the Duck thread is one I find genuinely funny. Howard the Duck has had what is probably the most consistent supporting character presence in the MCU. He appears in Guardians of the Galaxy in 2014, sitting in the Collector's Menagerie, drinking. He appears in Guardians Vol. Howard the Duck, appears briefly in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, 2017, at a bar. He has a tiny but real appearance in Avengers Endgame, fighting in the final battle, which is a fact most viewers don't notice because the shot is so brief and so crowded. He's been in What If episodes. The character was the subject of a famously catastrophic 1986 live-action film that lost a great deal of money and is sometimes credited with damaging George Lucas's career for a stretch. The MCU has rehabilitated him quietly into a recurring background gag. Marvel has acknowledged in interviews that they like having him around. He's a small ongoing tribute to the weirder corners of their own catalogue. Stan Lee's final post-death cameo, by the way, was in Avengers Endgame in 2019. He's seen in a brief de-age sequence during the 1970s portion of the time heist plot, driving a car with "Enough Said" sticker on it. The footage was filmed before his death in 2018, and the film became, in a quiet way, his proper send-off in the franchise. Honestly, given that we've now established his Watcher status, the de-aged 1970s cameo lands a little differently. It's a being out of time, briefly visible, smiling at the heroes he helped create. The Inhumans show, which we've already touched on, remains the most quietly disowned project in the franchise's history. Anson Mount came back as Black Bolt as a multiverse variant in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, in a way that allowed the franchise to nod at the character without acknowledging the show. Marvel has otherwise let the project sit and gather dust. It's not officially decanonized, it's just never referenced. The strange life of a project that exists in canon but functions as if it doesn't. What I find compelling about this whole bottom tier of the iceberg is how messy a franchise this big actually is, when you look at it carefully. The official story is clean: Iron Man, Avengers, Infinity War, Endgame, Multiverse Saga, and so on. The actual story is full of lawsuits and labour disputes and review bombing and disowned shows and a duck that keeps showing up. The franchise is, like any creative institution at this scale, a tangle of human decisions and accidents and recoveries. Most of those tangles get smoothed over by the time the next film comes out. A few of them stick around, sitting in the background of the franchise like statues in a sanctum, waiting for someone to notice. Anyway, that's most of it. Let's wind down. So that's the iceberg, or most of it. There are bits I left out, bits I forgot, bits I'm sure someone will mention in the comments, and I'll think, yes, fair, that should have been in there. A project the size of the MCU accumulates so much trivia and lore and behind-the-scenes weirdness that you could keep walking down the iceberg for another hour and still find things to talk about. We covered the bits I find most interesting. There's always more. Where the franchise sits now, in the spring of 2026, is somewhere unusual. The next major release is Avengers Doomsday in December 2026. The film after that is Avengers Secret Wars in December 2027. The Doomsday production wrapped in September of 2025, and additional photography is reportedly happening in early 2026, the the standard Marvel pattern of refining the film in post. Robert Downey Jr. is the centerpiece of both. The Russo brothers are back. Kevin Feige is, by all accounts, almost entirely focused on these two films. In a way, he hasn't been on individual projects in years. There's a sense, hard to describe but definitely present, that the franchise is about to attempt something it hasn't really attempted before. A soft reset of its own, with the chance to keep what's working and let go of what isn't. What I find genuinely strange about this franchise, when I sit and think about it, is how many times it has reinvented itself since 2008. The Phase 1 MCU was a small, slightly scrappy operation, putting out modestly budgeted hero films with a shared continuity. The Phase 2 and 3 MCU was a confidently dominant blockbuster machine, producing the biggest films in the world and culminating in the Infinity Saga. The Phase 4 MCU was a sprawling, experimental, Disney Plus inflected experiment that produced some of the franchise's best work and some of its weakest. And the Multiverse Saga as a whole has been a slightly anxious, course-corrected, mid-pivot operation that's tried to find its footing while the world around it kept shifting. By the time Secret Wars comes out and the next saga begins, the MCU will have been 5 or 6 different things. That's an unusual life cycle for a film franchise. Most film franchises are basically the same thing for their entire run and then die. Marvel keeps becoming new versions of itself and surviving. The thing I'll leave you with, if it's worth leaving you with anything, is just how contingent so much of this has been. A casting decision that nearly went the other way, a loan that could have gone bad, a corporate restructuring that came 2 years too late, or 2 years too early, a phone call from an actor that may or may not have saved a deal, an arrest that ended an entire planned villain arc, a man in a costume at a premiere, a Shakespearean theatre director making a film about Norse gods. None of this was inevitable. Most of it could have gone differently, and the shape of modern blockbuster cinema, which is to a substantial degree the shape of what Marvel Studios decided to do at various forks in the road, would look completely different if any one of those small decisions had landed somewhere else. It's an interesting thing to sit with. The biggest film franchise in modern history is structurally a series of close calls and improvisations and recoveries. The official story is much cleaner. The actual story is full of contingency and accident and the slow accumulation of decisions made by people who didn't know how it would all turn out. Which, when you think about it, is probably how most things, at this scale, actually work. The clean version is the marketing. The messy version is what happens.